The attic smelled of old paper and forgotten time. Marcus Chen stood among cardboard boxes and dust-covered furniture, sorting through his grandmother Elena's belongings 3 weeks after her funeral. At 42, he'd spent 15 years with NASA before a spinal injury grounded him permanently. Now he moved slowly, carefully, his back protesting each bend and lift. His grandmother had been 93 when she died, sharp-minded until the very end. She'd lived alone in this Philadelphia brownstone for the last decade, refusing to move into assisted living. "I've got my memories here," she'd always said, patting the walls like old friends. Marcus had never understood what she meant until now. Behind a stack of vinyl records, his fingers brushed against something hard. He pulled out a leather journal, its cover cracked and faded to a dusty brown. The binding was loose, pages yellowed at the edges. No title marked the front, just a small brass clasp that opened with surprising ease. The first page stopped his breath. Property of Elena Vasquez. Project Starward. Classified. 1962-1965. Marcus sank onto a wooden crate, his hands trembling slightly as he turned the page. His grandmother's handwriting, younger and more energetic than he'd ever seen it, filled the lines with careful precision. January 15th, 1962. Today I met the others. 24 of us total, chosen from thousands. We're going to the stars. We're actually going to leave Earth forever and build something new. I can barely breathe when I think about it. He read faster, flipping through pages that detailed a secret international program he'd never heard of in all his years with NASA. Project Starward. A one-way mission to establish humanity's first deep space colony. Planned for launch in late 1965. The volunteers would travel in cryosleep to a planet orbiting Proxima Centauri, never to return. The entries grew more technical as months passed. Elena had been chosen as the mission's chief medical officer. The training was brutal. Survival simulations, zero-gravity exercises, psychological evaluations. But through it all, one name appeared with increasing frequency. James Whitmore. March 3rd, 1962. James solved the water reclamation problem today. He's brilliant, the kind of engineer who sees solutions where others see only obstacles. When he explains his designs, his whole face lights up. I find myself inventing reasons to visit the engineering lab. Marcus smiled despite himself. His grandfather James had died when Marcus was 12, a quiet man who'd run a small electronics repair shop downtown. Marcus remembered him as patient and kind, teaching him to solder circuit boards on Saturday afternoons. He'd never imagined his grandfather. As a young engineer preparing for interstellar travel, the diary entries became more personal as 1962 turned to 1963, July 18th, 1963, James. Kissed me tonight after the centrifuge training. We both know the rules, no serious attachments, nothing that might compromise the mission. But when you're planning to spend the rest of your life with 23 people on another world, how can you not fall in love? We've decided we don't care about the rules. We have each other, and we have the stars. That's enough. Marcus's throat tightened. His grandmother had been 26 then, his grandfather 28. In the faded photograph tucked between pages, they stood together in silver training suits, young and radiant, arms around each other, smiling at a future among the stars. The entries detailed 3 years of preparation. The volunteers became a family. They learned each other's strengths and weaknesses, planned their colony's first structures, argued about governance and agriculture and education for children they'd never have. They were building not just a mission, but a civilization. Then came October 1965, 2 weeks before launch, October 12th, 1965. I'm pregnant. The words were written in shaking handwriting, underlined 3 times. The test is positive. I'm 8 weeks along. I haven't told James yet. I haven't told anyone. The mission rules are absolute. No pregnant women due to radiation exposure during the journey. If I report this, I'm out. But if I hide it? The next entry was dated 2 days later, October 14th, 1965. I told James last night. He held me while I cried. Then he said something I'll never forget. The stars will always be there, Elena. But you and our child, you're right here, right now. There's no choice to make. I told him he's being stupid. This is his dream. This is everything we've worked for. 3 years of our lives. He just smiled and said, "No, you're everything I've worked for." The mission was just what brought us together. Marcus wiped his eyes, surprised to find them wet. October 16th, 1965. James informed the project directors today. They've removed him from the mission roster. The launch will proceed with a replacement engineer, Victor Park, one of the alternates. James hasn't looked back once. He's already talking about opening that repair shop he's always dreamed of, about raising our baby, about building a life here. I keep asking if he regrets it. He keeps saying no. I don't know if I believe him. I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself for taking his dream away. The diary ended there, abruptly, as if Elena couldn't bear to write another word. Marcus sat in the dusty attic as afternoon light faded through the small window. Below him, Philadelphia hummed with evening traffic. His grandmother and grandfather had built their life in this house, raised his father here, grown old together. His grandfather's repair shop had supported them modestly for 40 years, until James retired at 70. It had seemed like such a small, quiet life. Now Marcus understood it was the grandest adventure of all. He closed the diary carefully and stood, his back aching. He had questions now, so many questions. What happened to Project Starward? Why had he never heard of it? What became of the other volunteers? And most importantly, had his grandfather ever truly been happy with the choice he made? Marcus descended the attic stairs, the diary pressed against his chest. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Somewhere up there, his grandparents had almost lived. Instead, they'd chosen Earth. They'd chosen each other. He thought about his own abbreviated career, how bitterly he'd resented the injury that grounded him. Maybe, he thought, there were other ways to reach the stars. Other kinds of journeys worth taking. The diary felt warm in his hands, alive with secrets. Tomorrow, he decided, he would start searching for answers. Tonight, he would simply sit with this story, this beautiful, heartbreaking story of dreams deferred and love chosen. In the growing darkness, Marcus opened the diary one more time to the photograph of Elena and James in their silver suits. They looked so young, so full of impossible hope. He whispered to their frozen smiles, "Tell me the rest. Tell me what happened after you stayed." The stars outside offered no answers, but Marcus knew where to look. The truth was waiting, somewhere in the 60 years between that final diary entry and today. Waiting in the lives of people who'd been left behind by the stars but had conquered something far more profound, the quiet heroism of an ordinary life, lived with extraordinary love. Marcus spent 3 weeks searching. The National Archives had no record of Project Starward. NASA's historical database showed nothing. Every official channel led to dead ends, as if the program had been erased from history entirely. But Marcus was an astronaut. He'd learned long ago that impossible problems just required creative solutions. He found his first lead in an obscure academic paper from 1987 about abandoned Cold War space initiatives. A footnote mentioned volunteers from an unnamed international colony project, who later contributed to various scientific fields. The author had interviewed 3 of them, but never published their names. Marcus tracked down the author, now a retired professor living in Vermont. After some persuasion and proof of his grandmother's involvement, she gave him 3 addresses. The first was a lighthouse on the coast of Maine. Thomas Rivera answered the door in faded jeans and a wool sweater. His face weathered like driftwood, but his eyes still sharp at 87. He studied Marcus for a long moment before speaking. "You have Elena's jawline," he said quietly. "I'd know that anywhere. Come in." The lighthouse keeper's quarters were filled with navigation charts, model ships, and photographs of space. Vintage NASA missions, constellation maps, a framed picture of Earth from orbit. Thomas made coffee in silence, his movements economical and precise, the habits of a man who'd trained for zero gravity never quite forgotten. "I was going to pilot the colony ship," he said, settling into a worn armchair. "Best job in the universe, or so I thought. Then Elena got pregnant, James withdrew, and suddenly the mission felt different. Wrong somehow. You left too?" Marcus asked. Thomas nodded slowly. 2 days before lunch. I couldn't stop thinking about my sister back home. She'd just had a daughter, my niece. I realized I'd never see her grow up, never know what happened to my family. James made his choice for love. I made mine for blood. He paused. Some called us cowards, said we wasted years of training. What do you think? The old pilot smiled. I think I spent 40 years running lighthouse rescue operations, saved 237 lives, raised my niece when my sister died, and watched 3 generations of my family grow. The stars are beautiful, Marcus, but they're cold. People are warm. Marcus found the second volunteer in Baltimore. Catherine Webb's urban farm occupied an entire city block, a green oasis of vertical gardens and greenhouse towers. At 89, she moved through the rows of vegetables with surprising agility, her silver hair tied back, dirt under her fingernails. "I was the mission botanist," she said, handing Marcus a ripe tomato. "Spent 3 years designing closed-loop agricultural systems for an alien world. When the mission fell apart, 5 of us withdrew after James and Thomas left. I felt lost, purposeless." She gestured at the thriving farm around them. "Then I realized Earth needed the same systems. Urban areas were food deserts. People were disconnected from where their meals came from. So I built this, 35 years of feeding communities, teaching children about ecosystems, proving you could grow forests in concrete jungles. Do you regret not going?" Catherine pulled off her gardening gloves, her expression thoughtful. "Every single day for the first decade." Then one afternoon, a little boy who'd been in my after-school program came back as a teenager. He told me he was studying environmental science because of me. That's when I understood. You don't have to leave Earth to change worlds. You just have to change the world you're on. The third volunteer was hardest to find. Victor Park had moved 7 times in 60 years. Marcus finally located him in Seattle, running a vintage electronics shop crammed with old radios, telegraph machines, and communication equipment from every era. At 90, Victor was the oldest surviving volunteer. He sat behind a workbench covered in circuit boards, soldering iron in hand, completing repairs with steady fingers. "I was the replacement," he said, not looking up from his work. "When James withdrew, they called me the alternate. I had 48 hours to say goodbye to Earth forever." He finally set down the iron and met Marcus's eyes. "I didn't go. Why not?" Victor stood and walked to a wall covered in photographs. Families, children, elderly couples, hundreds of faces. These are people I've connected over the years. Lost family members finding each other, emergency radio broadcasts during disasters, love letters sent across oceans. I chose communication devices over cosmic distances. He smiled. "Turns out Earth had enough distance to bridge. My grandfather James," Marcus said carefully. "Did you know him after?" Victor's expression softened. "James was my friend. We kept in touch until he died. He never regretted his choice, Marcus, not once. He told me a year before he passed that leaving would have been easier. No messy human complications, no uncertainty, just the clean purpose of survival and discovery. But staying required real courage. It required choosing the complicated, imperfect beauty of human love over the romantic simplicity of escape." That evening, Marcus sat in his hotel room with his notes spread across the bed. 3 people, 3 different reasons for staying, 3 extraordinary lives built from abandoned dreams. But questions remained. He called Thomas. "The mission, what happened to it?" "Did anyone actually go?" Static crackled on the line. "Check the repair shop," Thomas said cryptically. "Your grandfather's shop. There's a basement workshop Elena made him seal after he died. She said you'd find it when the time was right." Marcus caught the first flight to Philadelphia. The repair shop had been closed for 15 years, but Marcus still had keys. He entered through the back door, navigating by phone light through shadowed rooms filled with old televisions, radio sets, and computer parts. The basement door was hidden behind a false cabinet, exactly as Thomas described. The workshop below took his breath away. Blueprints covered every wall, rocket designs, life support systems, navigation algorithms. But these weren't from the 1960s. They were dated from 1968 to 2005, progressive improvements on the original Starward technology. A computer terminal sat dormant in the corner, its drives potentially containing decades of data. Marcus powered it on. The screen flickered to life, showing a directory of files. His hands shook as he opened one labeled Phoenix Initiative, 1992. The document revealed everything. Project Starward hadn't died, it had been reborn. The volunteers who stayed hadn't abandoned their work. They'd refined it, perfected it, and secretly fed their innovations to NASA and other space agencies through anonymous channels and shell companies. James's repair shop had been the hub, manufacturing precision components that found their way into Mercury, Apollo, and shuttle programs. The mission finally launched in 1998, renamed and reclassified. A colony ship carrying 200 volunteers had left for Proxima Centauri, built on technology that the Left Behind had spent 30 years improving. Marcus scrolled through technical specifications, recognizing his grandfather's elegant solutions to problems NASA had struggled with for decades. James hadn't abandoned the stars. He'd just found another way to reach them, through patience, through incremental progress, through the quiet, persistent work of building something greater than himself. A video file caught his attention. For Marcus, play when ready. He clicked it. His grandmother's face filled the screen, recorded perhaps a year before she died. She sat in the same workshop, surrounded by her husband's legacy. "Hello, my dear boy," Elena said, her voice still strong despite her age. "If you're watching this, you've found the truth. Your grandfather and I didn't give up our dreams. We transformed them. The stars were always the destination. But James taught me that how you reach them matters more than when. He chose love, yes, but in doing so, he proved that great achievements don't require great sacrifices. They require great dedication over time." She smiled, her eyes bright with tears. "You became an astronaut, Marcus. You went where we couldn't. Every time you orbited Earth, you carried our dreams with you. And now that you're grounded, remember, your grandfather's greatest work happened after he stayed. Your journey isn't over. It's just changing direction." The video ended. Marcus sat in the darkness of the workshop, surrounded by 60 years of quiet genius, and finally understood. His grandparents hadn't been left behind. They'd been the foundation. While others reached for distant stars, James and Elena had built the ladder that made reaching possible. He thought about his own injury, his forced retirement, the bitterness he'd carried. Maybe being grounded wasn't an ending. Maybe it was a beginning, a chance to build something that would outlast any single mission. Marcus stood and looked at the blueprints covering the walls. Tomorrow he would contact the other volunteers' families. He would document their stories, preserve their contributions. He would make sure the world knew that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who stay behind, who choose the long, patient work of making the impossible eventually inevitable. The stars could wait. Right now, Earth needed him, and that, he realized, was exactly what his grandfather would have said. Marcus spent 6 months piecing together the full story. He interviewed families of the original volunteers, tracked down declassified documents, and connected with former NASA engineers who'd unknowingly used components from his grandfather's shop. The deeper he dug, the more extraordinary the truth became. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when he received an email from someone named Dr. Helen Cartwright, Director of Deep Space Operations at NASA. The subject line read, "Your grandfather's work. We need to talk." They met at NASA headquarters in Washington. Helen was in her 60s, professional and intense, with the tired eyes of someone who carried significant secrets. She led Marcus to a secure conference room and locked the door. "Your investigation has triggered some internal alerts," she said, sliding a folder across the table. "Normally, we'd shut this down. But given your family's contribution and your own service record, you deserve the truth." Marcus opened the folder. Inside were photographs of spacecraft components, technical specifications, and a manufacturing label that made his chest tighten. "Whitmore Technical Solutions, Philadelphia, PA. Your grandfather supplied critical parts to every major NASA mission from 1970 to 2005, Helen continued. Navigation gyroscopes, life support valve assemblies, communication relay circuits, always through intermediaries, always anonymous. We didn't know who Whitmore Technical Solutions really was until after the company dissolved following his death. Why the secrecy? Helen pulled out another document. Because he was still technically bound by Project Starward's classification protocols. The program was never officially canceled, just postponed indefinitely. Your grandfather and the other volunteers who withdrew found a loophole. They couldn't participate in classified missions, but they could innovate in the private sector and make their developments commercially available. Marcus leaned forward. The Phoenix Initiative. The 1998 launch. Helen's eyebrows rose. You found that? Impressive. She pulled up a presentation on the room's screen. Project Phoenix. The direct successor to Starward. By 1990, technology had advanced enough to make the mission viable with a larger crew and better survival odds. Your grandfather's designs formed the core of the life support and propulsion systems. The screen showed a massive colony ship, sleek and powerful, nothing like the crude 1960s design from the original plans. 200 volunteers left Earth in March 1998. They're currently 12 years into a 40-year journey to Proxima Centauri. B. Last communication came through 6 months ago. All systems optimal. Colony preparations proceeding. Marcus stared at the ship, emotion welling in his throat. He made it happen. They all did, Helen corrected. Thomas Rivera's navigation algorithms, Catherine Webb's agricultural systems, Victor Park's long-range communication protocols. Every volunteer who stayed behind contributed something essential. They weren't left behind, Marcus. They were the foundation. She advanced the presentation to a new image, a Mars orbital station, gleaming against the red planet's surface. And their work continues. This is Whitmore Station, currently under construction in Mars orbit. Completion scheduled for next year. It will serve as the primary hub for Mars colonization efforts. Marcus couldn't breathe. They're naming it after my grandfather? After both your grandparents, Helen said softly. Elena's medical protocols are the basis for long-duration spaceflight health monitoring. Without her research, astronauts couldn't survive the journey. The station will bear both their names, Whitmore Vasquez Station. She paused, studying him carefully. There's something else. Something I think you should see. Helen led him through security corridors to an observation room overlooking a clean room facility. Inside, technicians worked on what looked like a probe or satellite, its surface covered in golden panels. That's the Starward Memorial Probe, Helen explained. Launching next month. It carries data cores containing the complete history of the original volunteers, their training records, personal journals, technical innovations. Your grandmother's diary is already digitized and included, with your permission to be requested posthumously through her estate instructions. Marcus pressed his hand against the glass. Where's it going? Proxima Centauri, on a faster trajectory than Phoenix. It should arrive about 5 years before the colony ship. When those colonists wake from their final cryosleep and enter orbit around their new world, the first thing they'll hear is a message from the people who made their journey possible. The volunteers who stayed behind. Tears blurred Marcus's vision. His grandparents would reach the stars after all, even if only as voices and data, as memory and legacy. There's one more thing, Helen said, her voice gentle. We'd like to offer you a position. Project Starward's history needs to be properly documented and preserved. You're uniquely qualified, retired astronaut, direct descendant of key contributors, already conducting the research. The position would be here in Washington, full archival access, comfortable salary. Marcus turned from the window, surprised. Me? Your flying days may be over, but your work isn't. Your grandfather spent 40 years building the future from a repair shop basement. Imagine what you could do with NASA's full resources. She smiled. Besides, we need someone who understands what it means to have your dreams change direction. Someone who knows that staying can be just as important as going. Marcus thought about the past 6 months, the interviews, the discoveries, the growing understanding of what his grandparents had really accomplished. He thought about his own bitterness at being grounded, how it had slowly transformed into something else as he learned their story. Purpose, maybe, or simply peace. I'll do it, he said. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood in the Kennedy Space Center observation area, watching the Starward Memorial probes launch. Thomas Rivera sat beside him in a wheelchair, 98 now, but insistent on attending. Catherine Webb had sent a video message from her hospital bed, too frail to travel. Victor Park stood at Marcus's other side, leaning on a cane, his aged eyes still sharp. James would have loved this, Victor said as the countdown began. Marcus nodded, clutching a photograph, the one from his grandmother's diary. Young Elena and James in their silver suits, smiling at impossible futures. They both would have, the rocket ignited. Fire and thunder filled the air as the probe began its journey, carrying the voices of the forgotten volunteers toward distant stars. Marcus watched it climb higher, a bright point of light ascending into blue, then vanishing into the darkness beyond. Beside him, his phone buzzed. A text from his father, Richard Whitmore, age 63, who Marcus had grown closer to during these months of discovery. The message was simple. Your grandfather always said the stars could wait. Glad they finally couldn't wait any longer. Proud of you, son, Marcus smiled. His father had grown up in that repair shop, watching James work magic with circuits and metal, never knowing the full scope of his father's secret legacy. Now, finally, the Whitmore family understood what they'd been part of all along. That evening, Marcus returned to his new office at NASA headquarters. The walls were still bare, but he'd begun filling them with photographs, the original Starward volunteers in training, Catherine's urban farm, Thomas at his lighthouse, Victor in his radio shop. And in the center, the photograph of Elena and James, young and radiant, holding each other before the stars. He opened his laptop and began writing. Not a technical report, but a story, the real story of Project Starward. The story of 24 people who trained to leave Earth forever, and the 5 who chose to stay. The story of how their staying became its own kind of journey, longer and harder than any space flight, requiring decades of patience and faith that their work mattered. He wrote about his grandfather's repair shop, that humble storefront that secretly supplied components to missions that rewrote human history. He wrote about his grandmother's medical research, conducted quietly in their home office, that now kept astronauts alive in the void. He wrote about Thomas, Catherine, and Victor, ordinary people who built extraordinary legacies from abandoned dreams. Most importantly, he wrote about himself. About being grounded, about feeling like his story had ended prematurely, about discovering that endings are just transitions to different chapters. His grandfather had taught him that, even across death, even across 60 years of silence. The stars weren't the destination. They never had been. The destination was always the work itself, the patient, persistent building of something greater than yourself, something that would outlast your years and carry forward into futures you'd never see. Marcus looked at the photograph again, at his grandparents' young faces frozen in that moment of infinite possibility. They'd had their choice stolen by biology and circumstance, or so he'd thought. But now he understood they'd made the choice themselves, consciously, bravely, knowing exactly what they were giving up and what they were gaining. They'd gained each other. They'd gained a son, a grandson, a family that stretched forward through time. They'd gained 40 years of waking up together, of building something real with their hands, of proving that heroism isn't always loud and spectacular. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's staying when everything in you wants to go. His phone buzzed again. Helen Cartwright sending him access codes to classified archives. "Welcome to the team," her message read. "Let's make sure their story never gets forgotten again." Marcus pulled up the first archive folder, his heart racing with familiar excitement, the same feeling he'd had before every rocket launch, every mission briefing. He was exploring again, just differently. He was reaching for truth instead of altitude, for understanding instead of velocity. Outside his window, Washington's lights spread like a terrestrial galaxy. Above them, invisible in daylight but always present, the stars waited. Somewhere among them, the Starward Memorial probe was beginning its 40-year journey. Somewhere farther still, the Phoenix colony ship drifted through the void, carrying 200 dreamers toward an alien dawn. And here, on Earth, in an office filled with photographs of the past and plans for the future, Marcus Whitmore typed the first words of a story that needed telling. They were supposed to conquer the galaxy. Instead, they conquered something harder, the quiet courage of staying behind. His grandfather's words echoed in his memory, spoken decades ago to a young boy learning to solder. "The universe is patient, Marcus. It'll wait for us. What won't wait is the person sitting next to you, the moment happening right now, the choice to be present in your own life." James had been present. Elena had been present. They'd lived fully in every moment they'd been given, never looking back at what might have been, always looking forward to what could still be built. Marcus saved his document and stood, stretching his aching back, the injury that had grounded him, that had seemed like a curse, that had actually been a gift. Without it, he never would have found the diary. He never would have discovered his family's true legacy. He never would have learned that sometimes the greatest adventures require you to stand still. He turned off the lights and locked his office. Tomorrow he'd continue the research, document more stories, preserve more history. But tonight, he had a dinner date with his father, a weekly tradition they'd started after discovering the truth about James and Elena. They'd sit in that old Philadelphia house, surrounded by memories, and talk about what it meant to be a Whitmore, what it meant to carry dreams across generations, even when those dreams transformed along the way. The elevator descended, and Marcus watched the floor numbers drop. He thought about trajectories, about how orbits sometimes degraded and brought you back to where you started. He thought about how that wasn't failure, it was completion. It was coming home. The doors opened to the lobby. Outside, evening was falling, the sky dimming to twilight. Marcus stepped into the warm air and looked up, searching for the first stars. They were there, waiting. They'd always been there. They always would be. And somehow, that was enough. Retry.